Spain, in the year 1661. A magnificent palace, a dynasty that had ruled half the known world, and a baby who had just been born, whose mere appearance made midwives recoil in horror. His name was Charles, Charles II of Spain, and he was the final result of 200 years of a family that believed it could defy the laws of nature through absolute power. Brothers marrying sisters, uncles with nieces, cousins with cousins, generation after generation, in an endless cycle of royal blood that kept growing more and more poisoned. Today, we're going to tell the story of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a family that conquered empires, accumulated unimaginable wealth, and controlled the fate of millions. But through their obsession with keeping their blood pure, they created monsters, and the last of them was so deformed, so broken, that when he died without heirs, he took with him not just a dynasty, but the end of an entire era of European history. To understand how we arrived at Charles, we need to go back in time. The story begins in the year 1477, when Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon married, uniting two of the most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. They were second cousins, nothing alarming by the standards of the time. European nobility always married amongst themselves. That's how things worked. It kept power concentrated, ensured that properties weren't divided among strangers, and initially, it worked well. Isabella and Ferdinand had 5 relatively healthy children. They conquered Granada, expelled the Moors, financed Columbus, and transformed Spain into an emerging superpower. But they established a dangerous precedent. Their children were strategically married to other European royal houses, always prioritizing connections that would maintain Habsburg power. And here the problem began. Because the Habsburg family wasn't just in Spain, they controlled Austria, parts of Germany, eventually the Netherlands, and they had a very clear policy: Habsburgs marry Habsburgs, keep the royal blood pure, keep power concentrated, keep strangers away. In the year 1516, Charles V became King of Spain. He was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand on one side, and of Maximilian Habsburg on the other, two Habsburg lines converging in a single person. Charles was powerful, ruling an empire where the sun never set. But there were already signs. He had the Habsburg jaw, a genetic deformity that made the lower jaw protrude forward, making it difficult to chew properly. It was visible, but not debilitating, just a family peculiarity. Charles married Isabella of Portugal in the year 1526. She was his first cousin, again, Habsburg blood mixing with Habsburg blood, and their children were already born with more evident problems. Philip II, who became king in the year 1556, had a much more pronounced Habsburg jaw. He also suffered from chronic gout, debilitating migraines, and there were rumors about his mental health periods of deep melancholy that left him unable to govern for weeks. But Philip II was still functional. He ruled for 42 years, expanded the empire, built the Escorial, kept Spain as the dominant power, and he married 4 times. His first wife was Maria of Portugal, his cousin. The second was Mary Tudor of England, older than him and without close blood relation, which could have helped, but she died without giving him children. His third wife was Elizabeth of Valois, French, again without close kinship, but she died young. And his fourth wife, Anna of Austria, was his niece, his own niece, his brother's daughter. This marriage, in the year 1570, marked a terrible acceleration in the family's genetic degradation. Because Anna was Habsburg on both sides. Her father was Habsburg, her mother was Habsburg, and now she was marrying her uncle, who was also Habsburg from both sides. The gene pool was closing like a trap. Anna gave birth to several children. Most died in infancy, but one survived, Philip III, born in the year 1578, and Philip III was visibly worse than his father. The Habsburg jaw was now so pronounced that he could barely close his mouth. He drooled constantly. He had difficulty eating. Chewing was almost impossible. He suffered from epileptic seizures since childhood. And mentally, he was considered simple by the standards of the time. He wasn't completely incapable, but he was far from the sharp intelligence of his ancestors, Philip III became king in the year 1598 at 20 years old, and he essentially handed government over to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, because he had neither the capacity nor interest in governing personally. He preferred parties, hunting, excessive religious life, and when it came time to marry in the year 1590, they chose Margaret of Austria for him, who was, you guessed it, his cousin, more Habsburg blood, more identical genes mixing, reinforcing, folding over themselves like metal being forged and reforged until it begins to crack. Margaret and Philip III had 8 children. 5 died in infancy or youth. Those who survived were visibly ill, but one of them, Philip IV, born in the year 1605, was designated heir, and Philip IV was a walking disaster. The Habsburg jaw was now so extreme that he couldn't chew solid food properly. He had to eat mainly soups and porridges. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing speech difficulties. He suffered from constant infections because he couldn't close his mouth completely, leading to chronic dental problems. And mentally, he oscillated between periods of lucidity and complete disconnection from reality. Philip IV became king in the year 1621, at 16 years old, and during his 44-year reign, the Spanish Empire began its terminal decline, not just because of his own limitations, but because Spain was being governed by a succession of increasingly incapable men. He lost Portugal. He lost parts of the Netherlands. The Spanish economy, already strained by constant wars, began to collapse. And through all of this, Philip IV maintained the family tradition. He married Elizabeth of Bourbon in the year 1615. She was his cousin. Once again, Elizabeth and Philip IV had multiple children. Most died in infancy. Of the children who survived beyond the first years, all had serious problems. Balthasar Charles, the designated heir, was sick from birth, with multiple physical deformities. He died at 16 in the year 1646. When Elizabeth died in the year 1644, Philip needed a new marriage to try to produce another heir. And here, the Habsburg family made the decision that would seal their fate in the most catastrophic way possible. Philip IV married Mariana of Austria in the year 1649. And here's the crucial, absolutely shocking detail. Mariana was his niece, his sister Maria's daughter. But more than that, Mariana was originally promised to Philip's son, Balthasar Charles. She was going to marry her cousin. When Balthasar died, instead of canceling the arrangement, they simply transferred Mariana to the father, uncle marrying niece. And not just any niece, but one who was Habsburg from literally every direction. Her parents were siblings. She was the product of a marriage between Habsburg brother and sister. The inbreeding coefficient of this marriage was astronomical. Genetically, Mariana and Philip IV shared more DNA than normal siblings share. They were uncle and niece, but also cousins in multiple different ways, connected through at least 6 different ancestral lines that converged. It was a genetic disaster waiting to happen, and it did. In the year 1661, Mariana gave birth to a boy, the last direct heir of the Spanish Habsburg line, Charles II. And Charles was, by any measure, a living tragedy. When the midwives saw him for the first time, some crossed themselves, others wept, because the baby that emerged was visibly and shockingly deformed. His head was disproportionately large for his body. The Habsburg jaw, which had been a peculiarity in Charles V, was now a grotesque deformity. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that there was a gap of several inches between his upper and lower teeth. He literally couldn't close his mouth. His tongue, enlarged and swollen, constantly hung out. He drooled uncontrollably. His eyes were too far apart, giving him a strange and vacant appearance. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. Charles didn't walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't speak clearly until he was 10. And even then, his speech was so slurred and poorly articulated that only those who knew him well could understand him. He suffered from frequent epileptic seizures that left him unconscious and trembling. He had constant fever, recurrent infections, chronic diarrhea. Court physicians recorded that he had only one testicle, and that one didn't function properly. He urinated irregularly and frequently suffered from painful retention. Mentally, Charles never developed beyond the capacity of a child. He had childish fascination with toys and simple games, but couldn't concentrate on matters of state for more than minutes. He was afraid of the dark, afraid of being alone, and frequently cried for no apparent reason. Tutors who tried to educate him reported that he forgot information immediately after learning it. He couldn't grasp abstract concepts, and he had violent emotional outbursts when frustrated, screaming and sometimes hitting servants who came too close. And this was the King of Spain. This broken, malformed, mentally incapable being was officially the most powerful man in one of the greatest empires in the world. His father, Philip IV, died in the year 1665, when Charles was only 4 years old. The regency was assumed by his mother, Mariana, who desperately tried to maintain appearances of normalcy. But it was impossible to hide reality. Official portraits of Charles were commissioned, of course, and they are absolutely revealing. The court painter, Juan Carreco de Miranda, tried his best to make Charles look regal. But even with all the artistic skill in the world, he couldn't completely hide it. The portraits show a pale young man with dead, vacant eyes, the deformed jaw impossible to completely disguise, the mouth permanently open. He looks more like an animated corpse than a living king. As Charles grew, it became clear that he would never be able to truly rule. The royal council governed in his name, factions fought for control, and Spain continued its decline. Other European countries watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. The great Spanish Empire, which had terrorized Europe for more than a century, was being governed by a man who could barely tie his own shoes. But there was still one crucial responsibility Charles needed to fulfill. He needed to marry. He needed to produce an heir. Because without an heir, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty would end with him. And so, in the year 1679, when Charles was 18 years old, they arranged his marriage to Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a French princess. She was 17, healthy, beautiful, and apparently fertile. It was the desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could give Charles a son. Marie-Louise was horrified when she met her future husband. Letters she wrote to family in France survived, and they are painfully frank. She described Charles as repulsive, incapable of functioning as a husband in any meaningful way. She mentioned that he couldn't chew properly, that he ate like an animal, that he drooled constantly. She wrote about his epileptic seizures, about how he screamed during nightmares, about his unpleasant smell of sickness and medication. And crucially, she revealed that Charles was impotent, or at least incapable of completing the sexual act in a way that would result in pregnancy. They tried for 10 years. 10 years of a marriage that was apparently torment for both. And there were no children, no pregnancies, not even a miscarriage, nothing. Marie-Louise died in the year 1689 at 27 years old, officially from natural causes, though there were rumors of poisoning. And Charles, now 28 years old, needed to try again. In the year 1690, he married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She was young, healthy, and came from a family known for fertility. Once again, the hope was that she could give Charles the impossible heir. But the result was the same. 10 years of marriage, no pregnancies, and meanwhile, Charles was deteriorating physically. In his 30s, he looked like a man of 70. His hair had fallen out. His teeth, already problematic, began to fall out. He developed leg ulcers that never healed. His epileptic seizures became more frequent and more severe, and he began to have hallucinations, seeing figures that didn't exist, talking to dead people. The royal physicians tried everything. Constant bloodletting that only weakened him further. Potions and elixirs of dubious efficacy. Exorcisms, because many believed Charles was possessed by demons. How else could his condition be explained? They even brought in a famous exorcist who spent days trying to expel evil spirits. It didn't work, obviously, because Charles's problem wasn't spiritual. It was genetic. It was the inevitable result of 200 years of extreme inbreeding. He was paying the price for generations of ancestors who thought they could defy nature. In the year 1700, Charles was dying. He was only 39 years old, but his body was completely ruined. He could barely get out of bed. He couldn't control basic bodily functions. His mind, never strong, was now almost completely lost. He spent days without recognizing anyone, staring into space, drooling, occasionally screaming for no reason. And there was the question of succession. Charles had no children. He never would. All the European powers knew this, and all were positioning themselves for what would happen when he finally died. There would be war. The War of Spanish Succession, which would tear Europe apart for more than a decade. But that was a problem for later. Charles died on the 1st of November in the year 1700, surrounded by doctors, priests, and courtiers. His body was exhumed in 1921 for medical examination. The report was shocking. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrefied. His body was so poorly preserved that it looked like he had died months, not hours ago. It was as if every organ had given up simultaneously, unable to continue sustaining life in something so fundamentally broken. And so ended the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Not with grandeur, not with glory, but with a man who was barely capable of functioning as a human being, much less as a king. 200 years of inbreeding marriages, of obsession with keeping blood pure, of refusal to allow strangers into the family, culminated in Charles the Bewitched, as he was called, a being so deformed that his very existence was an argument against the notion of pure royal blood. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is a brutal lesson about the consequences of extreme inbreeding. Modern geneticists have studied the family's genealogical tree and calculated that Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. For context, children of biological siblings have a coefficient of 0.25. Charles was, genetically, closer to being the child of siblings than any other configuration. And more than that, he was the cumulative result of generations of marriages between relatives. It wasn't just one case of inbreeding, it was layers and layers of it, each generation folding over the previous one. Genetic studies have identified at least 4 major recessive genes that were expressed in Charles, each contributing to different aspects of his deformities and disabilities. The Habsburg jaw was probably partial achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism that affected only certain parts of the facial skeleton. His reproductive difficulties were probably the result of Klinefelter syndrome or similar. His epileptic seizures and mental retardation were probably from multiple converging genetic causes, and all of this was preventable. If at any point during those 200 years the family had allowed marriages with strangers, with people from outside the Habsburg gene pool, the deterioration could have been stopped, even reversed. But they didn't. Out of pride, out of obsession with blood purity, out of fear of diluting their power, they continued marrying relatives with relatives, generation after generation, until they produced Charles, living proof that you cannot defy basic genetics without devastating consequences. And it wasn't just the Spanish Habsburgs. Other European dynasties made similar mistakes. The Romanovs in Russia with their hemophilia, multiple smaller European royal lines that disappeared not for lack of trying to produce heirs, but because their heirs were stillborn, died young, or were so deformed they couldn't have children of their own. History is full of families who thought they were special, that the rules of nature didn't apply to them because they were royal, divine, chosen. And nature proved, repeatedly, that no, that you cannot concentrate genes indefinitely without paying a terrible price. Charles the Bewitched is the supreme example of this. He wasn't a monster by choice. He was a victim of his ancestors' choices. Each generation that decided to marry cousin with cousin, uncle with niece, bringing the gene pool closer and closer together, was contributing to his eventual birth. He was inevitable. He was the logical endpoint of a trajectory that had begun more than a century before he was born. And when he finally came into the world, with all his deformities and disabilities, he was just the physical manifestation of something that had been building in the shadow of genealogical trees for generations. The final irony is that Charles was considered the result of witchcraft. His nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, reflected the belief that he had been cursed, that witches or demons had destroyed the Habsburg line. The truth was much more mundane and much darker. It wasn't witches who destroyed Charles. It was his own ancestors. Each inbred marriage was like adding another piece to a genetic trap that would eventually close upon their descendants. And Charles was the one who got caught in it, unable to escape, condemned from before birth by decisions made by people he never lived to meet. Today, when we look back at the history of the Spanish Habsburgs, we see not just the rise and fall of a dynasty. We see an involuntary experiment in human genetics conducted over centuries, without controls, without ethics, without understanding what they were doing. And we see the final result of that experiment, a man who could barely function, ruling an empire that was crumbling, the last living manifestation of a mistake that had been made repeatedly for 200 years. Charles II of Spain died without heirs, but his true legacy isn't the absence of children. It's the brutal lesson he teaches, that no matter how powerful you are, how much wealth you accumulate, how many empires you rule, you cannot defy basic human nature. You cannot concentrate genes indefinitely. And if you try, nature will eventually exact a price. And that price will be paid not by you, but by your descendants, by children who never asked to be born broken, by human beings who deserve better than to be involuntary genetic experiments. In the name of blood purity or dynastic pride, the Habsburg family of Spain learned this the hardest way possible. And Charles, poor Charles, paid the final price, born into a world he didn't ask for, in a body that didn't work, with a mind that never developed, forced to be king when he could barely be a person, and when he died, finally released from a life that could only have been torment. He took an entire dynasty with him, not through any fault of his own, but through the faults of all who came before him, and decided that pure blood was worth more than health, that power was worth more than humanity, that tradition was worth more than the life and well-being of their own descendants. This is the story of a family destroyed by inbreeding, and Charles the Bewitched is its final, tragic monument.